Any discovery of a Roman dodecahedron is remarkable and unusual, because there's not many more than 100 known to exist. Generally, a dodecahedron is a 12-sided item, and the Roman dodecahedron was about the size of a baseball.
Somewhere in an English field, a volunteer uncovers a bronze object that should not exist. 12 perfect faces, untouched by time, buried with deliberate care. The dig falls silent, because this isn't a mistake of history, it's a contradiction. For centuries, these objects were dismissed as curiosities, until a discovery at Norton Disney forced scholars to confront an unsettling truth.
The Roman dodecahedron, the mystery has finally been solved. These objects, which are sort of maybe 2,000 years old, the 300-year-old mystery as to exactly what these were used for has finally been solved.
Rome didn't overlook this artifact, it erased it. But why would an empire that documented everything choose silence here? Think about that. The most obsessive record-keeping civilization in history tracked military rations, private contracts, even personal habits, yet left not a single word about an object found more than 100 times across its western territories. No texts, no images, no explanations. So what was Rome hiding? And what made this object too dangerous to remember? The impossible geometry. Let me describe exactly what we're looking at, because the physical details matter, more than you might think. The Roman dodecahedron is a hollow bronze object with 12 perfectly formed pentagonal faces. Imagine holding something roughly the size of a tennis ball, but instead of smooth curves, you're touching flat geometric planes that meet at precise angles. Each of those 12 faces has a circular hole punched through its center, and here's where the strangeness begins. No two holes are exactly the same size. Some are wide enough to fit a finger through. Others are barely larger than a pencil. Even on the same object, the variation seems intentional rather than accidental, as if the different sizes served some purpose we can no longer identify. At every corner where the pentagonal faces meet sits a small rounded knob, sometimes cast as part of the whole piece in a single pour of molten bronze, sometimes soldered on individually with remarkable precision. These knobs appear on every authenticated dodecahedron ever found. They weren't decorative afterthoughts. They were essential to whatever function these objects served. The craftsmanship alone should give us pause. Many dodecahedra were created using lost wax casting, one of the most demanding metalworking techniques in the ancient world. The process required creating a wax model, encasing it in clay, heating the clay to melt out the wax, then pouring molten bronze into the resulting cavity at precisely controlled temperatures. Get anything wrong and the bronze cools unevenly, cracks, or fails to fill the mold completely. The fact that so many dodecahedra survived intact after 2,000 years testifies to the skill of their makers. Some are so perfectly balanced, they can rest evenly on multiple faces without tipping, a feature that serves no practical purpose for any tool we can identify, but suggests obsessive attention to symmetry. Their interiors are completely hollow with no internal fittings, no markings scratched into the metal, no residue consistent with mechanical use. They were made from bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that required trade networks and specialized knowledge to produce. Someone invested significant resources into creating these objects. Bronze wasn't cheap. The craftsmen weren't amateurs. And yet we cannot determine what purpose justified that investment. The distribution pattern deepens the mystery considerably. These dodecahedra appear almost exclusively in the outer provinces of the Roman Empire: Britain, Gaul, Germania, the Low Countries along the Rhine, places that were Roman in law and administration, but Celtic in spirit and ancestry. Not a single dodecahedron has ever been found in Rome itself. Not one from anywhere in Italy. Not one from the wealthy eastern provinces where Greek and Roman culture had flourished for centuries. For an empire obsessed with standardization,
the story of ancient Rome is a story of evolution. of how a civilization's ability to adapt and dominate can lead to its survival for over 1,000 years.
That geographic silence screams something significant. Roman manufacturing typically produced objects by the thousands, flooding the empire with identical pottery, tools, weapons, and coins. Mass production was a Roman specialty, yet only 130 dodecahedra have been found after 3 centuries of archaeological searching across an entire continent. That scarcity alone suggests these weren't ordinary objects meant for everyday use. They were rare, deliberately made in limited numbers, and apparently restricted to specific regions where Roman cultural control remained incomplete, and older traditions quietly persisted beneath the imperial surface. The theories that collapsed over the decades, scholars proposed dozens of explanations: military rangefinders, candlestick holders, knitting gauges, survey instruments. Each theory sounds reasonable until you actually examine the evidence, and then they fall apart one by one. The rangefinder theory suggested soldiers could look through the holes to estimate distances to enemy positions. The idea seemed clever at first. By aligning the holes and observing how much of a target appeared through them, one could hypothetically calculate range for artillery. But the holes vary wildly in size, even on the same object. There's no standard calibration between artifacts. No dodecahedron has ever been found with range tables, carrying cases, or anywhere near ballista equipment or surveying tools. If these were military instruments, they would have been found at military sites alongside other military equipment. They weren't. The distribution doesn't match known Roman military installations at all. The candlestick theory falls apart on basic physics. Many dodecahedra have open bottoms, making wax containment impossible.
And the wax is just going to drip straight through this thing. It's just not better than a plate or something. I don't know. Every explanation has its flaws. Everyone. There's no perfect explanation.
They show no scorch marks, no soot buildup, no heat discoloration of any kind. Objects used regularly with fire develop distinctive patterns of damage over time. These have none. The knitting gauge idea gained surprising popularity online, suggesting the varying hole sizes were used to produce different thicknesses of wool yarn for glove making. It's a charming theory with one fatal flaw. Roman textile work didn't require circular gauges. The technique they used, called nal binding, worked differently. More importantly, the metallurgical investment required to cast these precise bronze objects vastly outweighs the need for a household accessory. You don't commission expert bronze smiths to make something you could carve from wood in an afternoon. No wool fibers or fabric residue have ever been found inside any of them despite extensive testing. One by one, every practical explanation fails under scrutiny. And when conventional answers fail, unconventional questions begin. Norton Disney changes everything. In the summer of 2023, a quiet English village called Norton Disney became the epicenter of a discovery that would force historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Roman material culture. Unlike most Roman artifacts recovered by amateur metal detectorists pulling objects from random fields without context, this dodecahedron was different. It was excavated scientifically during a formal archaeological dig, layer by layer, with every piece of surrounding context documented and preserved. That methodological difference would prove crucial. The volunteers uncovered more than just the bronze object. They found Roman pottery fragments, 3rd century coins, iron tools, and the faint post-hole outlines of what may have been a villa or workshop. The dodecahedron wasn't randomly dropped or accidentally lost. It was buried carefully and deliberately, tucked into what archaeologists call a sealed context. That distinction transforms speculation into evidence because we know exactly what surrounded this object when it went into the ground. The object itself was remarkably preserved, maintaining an almost mirror-like patina with minimal corrosion after nearly 2,000 years underground. The soldered knobs at each corner remained fully intact. When lifted into the afternoon sunlight, its geometry created intricate overlapping shadows, pentagonal silhouettes dancing and layering across the ground as the angle shifted. One researcher on site reportedly said it looked designed to react to light, a comment that seemed casual at the time, but would spark theories no one anticipated. But preservation wasn't the only revelation. The deliberate burial raised deeply troubling questions. If this object was ceremonial, why was it hidden? If it was sacred, why was it buried in silence rather than placed in a temple or shrine? Some researchers now believe the dodecahedron may have been intentionally removed from circulation, decommissioned like a dangerous piece of forbidden knowledge that couldn't be destroyed but couldn't be allowed to remain visible either. Was this object feared? Was it part of a vanishing tradition pushed underground as Roman cultural dominance spread? The Frontier Secret. The geographic pattern tells a story that historians have struggled to explain for decades. Roman dodecahedra cluster in regions that were culturally Roman on the surface, but spiritually Celtic beneath. These were lands where Roman law ruled the streets and Roman architecture dominated the skylines, yet indigenous belief systems quietly survived in homes, forests, and sacred groves. Britain, Gaul, Germania, the exact regions where Rome struggled most to fully erase pre-Roman traditions. The placement of these discoveries adds another unsettling layer. Many dodecahedra have been found near burial sites, river crossings, and settlement boundaries. In Celtic belief systems, these were liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds. Rivers marked borders between the living and the dead. Boundaries held spiritual power that had to be respected and maintained. These aren't places where Romans casually dropped tools while marching or working. These are places where rituals happened, where the veil between worlds was considered thin. Several dodecahedra show minimal signs of handling. The edges aren't worn smooth. The holes haven't been polished by repeated use. The knobs remain sharp and well-defined. This suggests they weren't everyday objects carried around and used constantly like tools or instruments. Instead, they may have been brought out briefly for specific moments, used in controlled circumstances, then hidden or buried immediately afterward. That behavior pattern aligns with ceremonial objects, not practical tools. You don't hide a measuring device. You don't bury a candlestick. But you might conceal something connected to practices the authorities wanted eliminated. The absence of Roman documentation now looks less like an oversight and more like a deliberate choice, possibly even official policy. Roman law was deeply hostile to unauthorized religious practices. The Lex Cornelia criminalized magic, prophecy, and unsanctioned divination. Objects associated with those practices wouldn't be cataloged in official records. They would be ignored, suppressed, confiscated, or quietly eliminated from public life. Some archaeologists now cautiously suggest the dodecahedron represents a hybrid object, tolerated but never embraced by Rome, perhaps adopted by local elites who publicly followed Roman customs while privately maintaining older spiritual systems their families had practiced for generations. The science of shadows and residue. For centuries, researchers treated the dodecahedron as a mystery of form, focusing entirely on its shape and trying to reverse engineer a function from its geometry. But modern scientists shifted focus from what it looks like to how it actually behaves when subjected to natural forces. Teams from the University of Ghent and Oxford began creating precision replicas using 3D printing and traditional bronze casting, not to admire the design, but to test how the object interacts with light, heat, and combustion. What they discovered would add layers of strangeness to an already impossible puzzle. Placed in direct sunlight, the dodecahedra didn't cast random shadows like most objects. The holes projected circular beams that moved in symmetrical patterns depending on the time of day and the object's angle. One researcher described the effect as a solar dial without numbers, only movement. During testing conducted at the spring equinox, several models cast near-perfect pentagonal outlines that rotated slowly throughout the day as the sun's position changed. Could these objects have been used to mark sacred dates? Equinoxes and solstices held enormous significance in Celtic agricultural and spiritual traditions, determining planting cycles, harvest times, and ceremonial gatherings. The theory, once dismissed as fringe speculation, suddenly gained serious traction. But shadows weren't the only discovery. Oxford's Radiochemical Research Lab conducted residue analysis on 5 authentic dodecahedra from different archaeological sites across Europe. 3 contained trace amounts of burnt organic matter, microscopic carbon particles, oxidized copper salts, and far more disturbing faint traces of animal blood proteins that had survived nearly 2 millennia. Alongside those biological traces came botanical residues, including lavender, thyme, and resin from pine or fir trees. Every one of those plants appears in ancient records associated with funeral rituals and purification rites in both Roman and Celtic traditions. They were burned during ceremonies for the dead, used to cleanse spaces of spiritual contamination, and employed in practices meant to communicate with ancestors. The chemical structure of some residues partially matched recipes used in ancient embalming mixtures, particularly formulas documented in Gaul. This wasn't random contamination accumulated from centuries sitting in the ground. The residue patterns pointed to deliberate burning of ritual substances inside or near the object.
An ancient Roman artifact. This tiny piece of bronze was once part of a mysterious object known as a Roman dodecahedron.
The dodecahedron, long thought to be a puzzle of pure geometry, may have functioned as a sacred vessel, one used in ceremonies involving fire, sacred scents, and possibly sacrifice. The forbidden manuscript. In late 2024, researchers examining medieval manuscripts stored in isolated monastic archives stumbled onto something that had been hiding in plain sight for centuries. A 12th century Latin document, water-damaged and partially illegible from age and neglect, contained a phrase that had never been fully translated until advanced imaging technology made it readable. The text spoke of the orbis divinorum, the divine sphere. At first glance, the passage seemed like typical medieval religious allegory, the kind of mystical language monks often used when discussing spiritual matters. It described an object with 12 faces pierced and crowned, handled by the whispering ones of the forest, used to hear the voices of the stone sleepers. For decades, scholars had dismissed this as poetic metaphor, assuming it referred to some lost Christian relic or symbolic concept. But when high-resolution ultraviolet imaging revealed the full structure of the paragraph, researchers at the University of Basel noticed something deeply unsettling. The description matched perfectly with a bronze object featuring 12 perforated sides and rounded protrusions at each vertex. The Roman dodecahedron. The manuscript went further, and what it said changes everything we thought we understood. It warned that such spheres were not to be shown under the imperial eye, and were to be buried when the stars turned thrice upon the wolf's shadow. That phrase wasn't random medieval poetry. Astronomers matched it to a triple lunar eclipse cycle used in Druidic lunar calendars, a specific astronomical event that ancient Celtic priests used to mark sacred time.
For centuries, Rome was the most sophisticated metropolis in the ancient world. And Roman engineers also built breathtaking structures throughout Europe and the Mediterranean.
The instruction to bury these objects mirrors exactly how real dodecahedra have been found across Europe, intact and underground near celestial markers, as if following a protocol written down nowhere in official Roman records, but preserved in oral tradition that somehow survived into the medieval period. One section of the manuscript contained diagrams resembling shadow paths traced in pentagonal loops, possibly instructions for light manipulation rituals. Researchers now believe the passage refers to communication with or honoring of the dead, the stone sleepers mentioned repeatedly in the text. If this interpretation is correct, the dodecahedron wasn't just a curiosity, it was a tool for speaking with ancestors, and Rome wanted it destroyed. The 2025 bombshell. Earlier this year, a research paper leaked online before its scheduled publication sent shockwaves through the archaeological community and made international headlines in academic circles. A joint team of metallurgists from Britain, France, and Israel had conducted exhaustive analysis on the Norton Disney Dodecahedron alongside several others from private and museum collections using cutting-edge spectrometry and isotope dating techniques. Their conclusion demolished the foundation of nearly every mainstream theory that had been proposed over the past 3 centuries. The Norton Disney Dodecahedron wasn't Roman at all. Metallurgical testing revealed a bronze alloy composition more closely matching pre-Roman Celtic metallurgy, with trace element signatures that placed its origin firmly in the Iron Age tradition of the British Isles. The dating analysis pushed the object back at least 150 years before the Roman occupation of Britain. If the dodecahedron predated Roman conquest, it couldn't possibly have been a Roman military tool, a surveyor's instrument, or any kind of post-imperial religious artifact. The object belonged to the indigenous Celtic culture that Rome conquered and systematically tried to erase from history.
A St. Patrick's Day celebration of Celtic stories and songs, the Bluff Country Tale Spinners.
But the metallurgical findings weren't even the most disturbing part. Deep within the hollow chamber of the Norton Disney piece, scientists discovered microscopic traces of calcium phosphate, fused with amber resin and rendered animal fat. That specific combination appears in the archaeological record associated with funerary practices and necromantic rites throughout Iron Age Europe. The residue included a distinct isotope signature consistent with cremated human bone. Let that sink in for a moment. The dodecahedron may have functioned not just as a symbolic ritual vessel, but as an object actively used in ceremonies involving the remains of the dead. The fact that several dodecahedra have been found near human burial sites or among grave goods now seems far more than coincidence. It suggests a pattern, a practice, and a purpose that Rome found threatening enough to suppress completely. One major European museum quietly removed its dodecahedron display for re-evaluation after these findings went public, and several others are reportedly reconsidering their interpretive materials. The uncomfortable silence. Here's something that should deeply bother anyone who cares about historical truth. Despite over 130 confirmed discoveries across Europe, with some housed in major national museums visited by millions of people annually, the Roman dodecahedron has never been the central subject of any major funded archaeological research project. Not one full-scale institutional study was launched before 2020. Think about that. We've funded expeditions to find single pottery shards. We've spent millions investigating individual Roman latrines. And yet this genuinely mysterious object that defies all conventional explanation sat in museum storage rooms and private collections for decades without serious coordinated study. For an empire as thoroughly documented as Rome, that absence of scholarly attention is statistically bizarre and academically inexcusable. Several researchers now suggest this object represents an inconvenient anomaly, something that doesn't fit within Rome's carefully constructed narrative of law, order, and rational engineering. The dodecahedron defies that legacy. No inscriptions, no records, no mechanical purpose. It's a black hole in the timeline, and black holes make academic institutions deeply uncomfortable. The British Museum didn't display a dodecahedron until 2014, despite having one in their collection for decades. It sat in storage, unlisted in exhibitions, with curators privately admitting there was simply no interpretive framework that fit the object. A piece held in a Netherlands museum was incorrectly labeled for years as a weight or decorative item.
After nearly 20 years of planning, Norway's hotly anticipated new National Museum opened in Oslo this summer.
Until amateur researchers started asking questions the professionals had ignored. A leaked transcript from a European Heritage Conference in 2022 revealed deep frustration among younger archaeologists trying to study these objects. One speaker described the Dodecahedron as a career killer, a mystery too fringe to attract funding, too weird to publish in respected journals, and too disconnected from existing Roman categories to support thesis work or tenure applications. If true, that institutional bias may have delayed critical breakthroughs for decades while these objects sat unstudied in glass cases and storage drawers. But that silence is finally breaking. Independent researchers, open-source data analysts, and dedicated museum volunteers are piecing together patterns about ritual use, burial alignments, astronomical mapping, and even acoustic resonance experiments that mainstream archaeology overlooked or actively avoided for generations. What Rome chose to forget. We started with a simple question. What is the Roman dodecahedron? The answer turns out to be far more unsettling than any practical explanation could ever offer. This object may represent something Rome feared enough to erase from history entirely, a device from a conquered culture tied to beliefs the empire couldn't tolerate, used in rituals involving light manipulation, sacred astronomical dates, and communication with the dead. The evidence accumulated over 3 centuries of discovery points towards ceremonial use in Celtic spiritual practices, possibly adopted by Romanized locals who publicly conformed to imperial culture while privately maintaining older traditions their families had practiced for generations before the legions arrived. The deliberate burials in liminal spaces, the traces of burnt offerings and human remains, the absence from Roman records, and the survival of oral traditions into medieval manuscripts all suggest these objects held genuine power in the minds of those who used them. Power that Rome found threatening. Rome documented almost everything. The silence surrounding the dodecahedron now looks less like an oversight and more like policy. Some things weren't meant to be remembered. Some knowledge was considered too dangerous to preserve. And perhaps some objects were buried not because they were worthless, but because they were too powerful to leave in the light. The Roman dodecahedron remains officially unexplained. 300 years of discovery, and not a single agreed-upon answer. Found across the former empire, meticulously crafted and yet completely absent from Rome's records, it raises a far more unsettling question than what was it used for? What did Rome decide was too dangerous to remember? If an empire that cataloged its world with ruthless precision could erase this, what else was removed from the historical record? Beliefs, practices, entire ways of understanding reality. And as more objects emerge from the soil of Britain, Gaul, and Germania, how many truths are still waiting to force a rewrite of the past? This mystery doesn't end here. It's only widening. So ask yourself, when history goes silent, who decided what was allowed to survive? Until next time, keep questioning what they taught you in history class. The real story is always stranger than the textbook version.